Hi everyone, I'm Yuan Yihong from Tongji University. My speech today is Factor Decomposition Analysis and Causal Mechanism Investigation on Urban Transport Carbon Emissions in Chinese megacities. Case study of Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. Now first comes to the background. With the continuous advancement of urbanization, urban carbon emissions have become the most important source. At the same time, urban transportation carbon emissions plays an important part in the total urban carbon emissions, the same in the total transport carbon emissions. We can see in 2019, China's urban transportation carbon emissions accounted for more than 40% of transportation carbon emissions. As China gradually enters the second urbanization, the urban transportation system is becoming more complex and which has extremely high research significance. Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, as four megacities in China, are of great significance in carbon reduction. They have good policies and technologies and have different culture and geographic location. By studying them, we can learn good experiences and use them in other cities. Now, by summarizing existing literature, we found that most studies use a top-down approach and LMDI decomposition method. This approach does not allow for a comparative analysis of the contribution of different modes of transportation to carbon emissions. Also, existing research links systematic and in-depth causal mechanism and analysis and comparative research between different countries, different cities, and its connection with relevant transportation policies is also weak. So in this situation, we considered all transport activities as an integrated system. They can be divided into three parts: trip generation, dependency on cars, and technology level. Due to this mechanism, it is possible to analyze the causal mechanism of urban transport emissions. And the index decomposition method is a powerful tool for tracing driving forces and influential factors. The total carbon emissions can be obtained by the following equation. This method is the most commonly used one and has the advantage of linking redundancy. Based on the analysis of causal mechanism, three factors affect carbon emissions. The first one is we call avoid, which means trip generation. The second one is shift, we call it mode shift. And the third one is improve, which means technology level. And we can see the first one includes population, trip generation rate, and travel distance. And the second one, the mode shift, describes the dependency of cars. And the load factor, the fuel efficiency, is a component of the technology level, which also means the improved part. And in this research, we use the prevailing decomposition approach, LMDI, to trace the driving factors of urban transport emissions. And each individual factor that affects carbon emissions from the basis year to the end year can be calculated. And by using the method what we showed on the screen, we can just to calculate it all the factor. And then comes to the case introduction. We select 4 Chinese megacities to study. The first one is Beijing and Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. They all have good economic and large population. And the data we used to study are obtained from 2 channels. The first is first-hand data from surveys and reports, And the second is the second-hand data from statistic rare books. And now we can see from the from their GDP data, their GDP continue to increase. And compared with per capita GDP, we can see that Shenzhen has the highest per capita GDP. And before 2019, per capita GDP continued to increase in the 4 cities. But after that, affected by the COVID-19, as we all know, they are all declined to varying degrees, of which Shenzhen also declined the most. In terms of population, the population of Beijing and Shanghai is higher than that of Shenzhen and Guangzhou. After 2014, Beijing and Shanghai were relatively stable, but the population of Guangzhou and Shenzhen increased significantly and largely. And now just compare their urban transport development. Their travel rates rose first, and we can see in the picture, and then it fell down and plummeted in 2020, also because of the COVID. There has been a general increase in the average travel distance of all transport modes. And in terms of mode sharing, we can see that Shenzhen's green transportation, which include walk and biking, is the best. It has high share of walking and cycling modes compared with other 3 cities. The share rate of public transport in the 4 cities is increasing, and the share of cars is declining. However, we can still see that there is a competitive relationship between buses and subways in public transportation. And according to the established method, the carbon emissions of urban traffic are calculated, and the influencing factors are decomposed. After calculating the total transport carbon emissions, and we compare them with the transport carbon emissions in Tokyo, New York, and London, we can see that for the total emissions, the emission of Tokyo, New York, and London have already reached the peak and started to decline, while the emission of our 4 Chinese cities are still increasing. And compared with the per capita carbon emissions, New York has the highest emissions, and Tokyo and London, the emission of Tokyo and London are also higher than our 4 cities, which means that we still have a lot of room for growth. And it also means that it will be more difficult for us to reduce the emissions in the future. And then comes to the decomposition analysis. During the 2005 to 2010, for the 4 cities, the city continued to expand, the population increased continuously, and the travel distance increased, showing that the most significant carbon increasing effects. After that, cities have developed their public transportation, especially subways, and the most share of cars is transferred to public transportation, which showing the carbon decreasing effects. And during 2010 to 2014, for Beijing, population growth slows down. Urban expand continues, and average travel distance increases, bringing about significant carbon increasing effects. For other 3 cities, load factor also show the carbon increasing effects. After 2014, we can see that 4 cities began to promote new energy cars, and among them, Guangzhou and Shenzhen have achieved better results, and their emission factors show better effects on reducing carbon emissions. Carbon emissions in Beijing and Shanghai became stable after 2014, while in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, the emissions are still increasing because of the population. And other factors also have an impact on carbon emissions in the four cities, but not the most important, so we just skip it for now. And we can see that from 2019 to 2020, the COVID-19 had a huge impact on carbon emissions. We can see in Shanghai and Shenzhen, the carbon emissions decreased mainly because of the travel rate has dropped a lot. And especially for Shenzhen, its load factor increased after the COVID-19 pandemic, resulting in a further reduction in carbon emissions. And in Beijing and Guangzhou, the carbon emissions has increased. The increasing effect of Beijing is that load factor offsets the reducing effect of the trip rate. And for Guangzhou, the increase in the population and the increase in the mode share of cars have become the most important factors that the carbon emissions increased. And by comparing the carbon emissions changes and driving factors of the four cities, we find that carbon emission changes can be divided into two types, policy-driven and market-driven. The former is represented by Beijing. Changes in carbon emissions are highly related to policies. The latter is represented by Guangzhou and Shenzhen, which changes are more regulated by the market. And then comes to the final part, the conclusion. We divided the period into two parts, before the COVID-19 pandemic and after that. Before it, we can see that different periods have different influencing factors. In early stage of urban expansion, transport carbon emissions increase rapidly, and the main influencing factors are population and travel distance. In the sustainable development stage, transport carbon emissions increase slowly, and the main factors are other factors like mode share and load factors. In the stable development stage, transport carbon emissions remain stable and start to decline. In this period, the decline in the emissions mainly depends on the reduction of emission factors. But when times come to the 2020, we all know that COVID-19 pandemic has happened and have huge impact on transportation. Most obviously, the travel rate of each city has dropped, while the mode share of cars has increased. However, affected by the different reasons such as management, control policies, and urban development, the final impact on urban transportation carbon emissions is also different. And that's why we can see Shanghai and Shenzhen, the emissions decreased, while Beijing and Guangzhou, the emissions increased. Different cities have different characteristics, also have different causal mechanism. Combined with the above analyzed results, the recommendations for these four cities are still waiting to be studied in the future. And that's all. Thanks for listening. And questions are welcome.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your interesting report. I'm very interested in your traffic carbon emission, and I know that you use LMDI. And is there any special features in traffic carbon emission, except for the POP and the GDP, and you use investigate data, and your data is across year from the year 2005 to the year 2020. So I'm interested in what investigate data you used.
We use the data mainly from the statistical yearbook, and also some the first-hand report data and from some survey, and also some data that just we calculated them, such as the fuel efficiencies. Most of the data about traffic, such as the traffic, the travel distance, and the trip generation rate, and also the mode share is from the traffic statistical yearbook from the 4 cities in different years. And
Okay. And we will have the future research plan about this topic.
Yes. By looking at the data, we still find some interesting phenomena, such as we can see the different appearance in the same stage of the four cities, and we wonder whether the more detailed policies, or just like the some other market behaviors will have caused these differences. So we will just try to find out the reason, and also we will try to make a further study on the mechanism in this field.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your report. Okay, let's move on to the third speakers.